The first sound was the rope complaining against wood, a low, tired groan that seemed to come from the land itself. And Elias Crowder felt it crawl up his spine before he ever lifted his eyes, because that sound meant a line had been crossed and there was no riding back over it. Not in Dry Creek, not anywhere God had forgotten to finish shaping. And when he finally looked, he saw her suspended between posts of weathered pine, wrists bound high, ankles drawn wide, dust clinging to her bare calves like shame she refused to wear, her breath coming hard as if the prairie itself were pressing down on her chest, and the whole yard was quiet, except for the horse shifting behind her, leather creaking, steam rising from its flanks, the animal uneasy in the presence of something wrong it could not name. And Elias thought, not for the first time, that a man could lose his soul in small steps or one terrible leap, and today felt like the leap. Her name was Mara Bell, and she had arrived in that Dry Creek 6 months earlier with nothing but a rusted trunk and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much sky and not enough mercy, and the town had watched her the way people watch storms, with fascination and fear and a secret hope that it would pass them by. But storms don't ask permission, and neither had Mara when she stood up to the cattle baron's son, when she refused to sell her claim, when she said no in a town that believed no was a challenge. Elias had tried to stay out of it, tried to keep to his fences and his cattle and the narrow strip of land he still called his own after drought and debt had taken their turns at him. But when Sheriff Holt came with his badge dull and his eyes already looking away, when the men gathered with rope in their hands and righteousness on their tongues, Elias knew staying out of it was just another way of choosing a side. And the worst part was that he had been chosen for a role he never asked for, because he was the one with the sturdy posts in his yard, the one with the reputation for order, the one the sheriff trusted to hold her steady while the law decided what to do. Mara's head was bowed at first, dark hair loose and wild, sweat tracing lines through dust on her face, and when she lifted it, her gaze found Elias with a precision that cut deeper than accusation, because there was recognition there, and disappointment, and something like grief, as if she had hoped better of him even when he had not hoped better. Of himself, and her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady, asking his name as if she already knew it and wanted to hear him admit it out loud. And he said it, because lies felt heavier than truth in that moment, and she nodded once, as if filing it away for whatever came next. The town had begun to gather beyond the fence line, boots crunching dry grass, murmurs rising and falling like a bad tide, faces hardened by sun and habit, some eager, some uneasy, all complicit by their presence. And Elias felt the weight of every eye pressing him forward, fixing him in place, because a man could disappoint one woman and live with it. But disappointing a town came with consequences that lasted longer than any bruise. And yet his hands trembled when he checked the knots, when he made sure they were secure but not cruel. A small mercy, he told himself, mattered, even as he knew it did not. Mara laughed then, a short, sharp sound that startled the horse and turned heads, and she said, "Mercy, that needs to be measured, isn't mercy at all. It's just fear wearing clean clothes." And the words struck Elias harder than any blow, because they were true in a way he had spent his life avoiding. And he thought of his wife, buried on the hill with a stone he still owed money on. Thought of the promises he had made to survive, to keep the ranch whole, to not die like his father had, proud and broken. And he wondered when survival had started to look so much like surrender. The sheriff cleared his throat and spoke about order and example and how sometimes pain taught lessons words could not. And the crowd nodded because people liked lessons that did not land on their own skin. And Elias heard someone shout from the back, something ugly and eager, and the sound turned his stomach, because it meant the town was slipping past anger into something worse, something that fed on itself. And Mara's breathing changed then, slower, deeper, as if she were gathering herself for a long walk into darkness. And she looked at the sky, blue and endless and indifferent, and Elias followed her gaze and felt small beneath it, a man made of dust pretending at permanence. He remembered a different day, months ago, when Mara had stood at his fence line and talked about wind and soil and the way land could be coaxed into giving if you listened to it. And he had listened then, really listened, because her voice had carried hope like a contagion, and he realized, with a sick clarity, that this was the price of that hope, that the town was not punishing her for defiance, but for reminding them of something they had lost. And that realization brought with it a terrible responsibility, because if hope was the crime, then silence was the accomplice. The rope in his hands felt alive, a snake coiled and waiting, and the sheriff's eyes flicked to him with a question that was really an order, and the crowd leaned forward as one, breath held, and in that stretched-out moment Elias felt the future, branching like a river in flood, one path leading back to his quiet misery, the other into a fire he might not survive. And he thought of Mara's words, of fear and clean clothes, and something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not heroically, but enough to let a different kind of air in. And when he stepped closer, when he reached up toward the knot that held her fate, Mara turned her head and met his eyes again. And this time, there was no disappointment there at all. Only a raw, fierce plea that carried no words but said everything. And somewhere behind him a voice rose, sharp and commanding, shouting his name, and Elias froze with his hand on the rope, the town's fury cresting, the sheriff's patience snapping, and the future balancing on a single trembling decision that had not yet been made. The shout snapped the moment in two, but Elias Crowder did not turn, because some choices, once felt, refused to be unmade, and he tightened his grip on the rope instead of letting go, feeling the coarse fibers bite into his palm like a warning from God himself. And when Sheriff Holt strode forward with his hand near his gun, Elias heard the crowd shift, anger sharpening into expectation, the ugly kind that wants blood to prove it's still alive. And Holt said his name again, slower now, reminding him of debts forgiven, lines not crossed, favors remembered. And Elias thought of how every favor came with a rope tied to it, how every kindness in Dry Creek had always ended in a ledger. And he answered the sheriff, not with words but with motion, pulling the knot loose just enough for the tension to change, just enough for Mara to feel it. And she did, drawing in a breath that sounded like the first air after drowning, her eyes widening, not with hope but with disbelief, because miracles in places like this were usually lies that came too late. The crowd erupted then, shouts tearing loose, men surging against the fence, someone throwing a stone that missed and thudded into dirt, and Holt cursed, reaching for Elias, but Elias stepped back, planting his boots, raising his voice for the first time in years, not loud but steady, carrying the weight of a man who had finally decided what kind of regret he could live with. And he said, this ends now, not tomorrow, not after an example is made, but now, because there is no law in cruelty and no order in terror. And his words were met with laughter and fury, in equal measure, because truth spoken too late sounds like betrayal to those who have already chosen violence. Holt lunged, but before he could reach the rope, a shot cracked the air, sharp and final, and silence fell like a dropped plate, because the sound of a gun in Dry Creek always meant someone's future had just ended, and Elias felt a hot punch in his shoulder that spun him halfway around, pain blooming bright and shocking, his knees buckling as the rope slipped from his grasp, and he tasted dust and blood as he hit the ground. The sky above him a hard, uncaring blue. Through the ringing in his ears he heard chaos break loose, horses screaming, people scattering, and another shot rang out, then another, and Elias realized dimly that Mara was no longer bound the way she had been, because the tension was gone, the post standing empty, rope ends swinging uselessly in the wind, and she was on the ground beside him, hands raw but free, tearing at his shirt to see the wound. Her face, fierce and focused, no panic there at all, just action, because survival was something she understood better than most. Someone shouted that the Baron's son was down, that blood was everywhere, and Holt's voice cut through, shouting orders that no one followed, because a town in frenzy listens only to itself. And Elias felt hands grab him, dragging him toward the barn as bullets thudded into wood, splinters flying. And he realized the horse had broken loose, crashing through the fence, its fear adding to the madness, and in the blur of it all, he caught sight of Mara again, standing tall in the open, her dress torn, her hair wild, shouting words he could not hear but felt in his bones, words that held the crowd back just enough for him to be hauled into shadow. The pain settled in then, deep and throbbing, each breath a labor, and he wondered if this was how his father had felt, lying in the dirt, realizing too late that pride and fear were poor companions at the end. And he laughed softly at the thought, because this time, at least, the choice had been his. The shooting stopped as suddenly as it had begun, the crowd breaking apart under the weight of what they had done, fear replacing fury as consequences loomed, and Holt appeared in the barn doorway, his face pale, his badge crooked, looking older than Elias had ever seen him, and he said it was over, that the Baron's son was dead, and the town would answer for it, that Mara was gone, vanished into the tall grass, with a horse and a head start, and Elias felt a strange peace at that, knowing she was free, even if he might not be. And he closed his eyes as Holt called for a doctor who might come too late. When Elias woke again, it was to quiet, the kind that comes after storms have stripped everything loose, and his shoulder burned, but his mind was clear, and a woman he barely knew pressed a cup to his lips, telling him to drink, telling him the town was changed, that men were packing, that others were staying but with their eyes lowered now, because blood had a way of teaching lessons words never could. And later, when he could stand, when he walked out into the yard where the post still stood, ropes cut and useless, he felt the weight of absence, but also the shape of something new, something fragile and earned. Days passed, and with them came the reckoning. Lawmen from beyond Dry Creek questions asked, stories told, and Elias told the truth, because lies no longer fit him. And the truth cost him his ranch, his land seized to pay debts and damages. But it left him with something else, a name spoken differently now. Not with trust, perhaps, but with respect, and that was more than he had ever owned outright. Months later, as he prepared to leave Dry Creek behind, his possessions few, his future uncertain, he found a note tucked beneath a loose board in the barn, written in a strong, slanted hand, saying only that the land had listened, after all, that the wind still carried his name, and that some debts could never be repaid, but could be honored. And Elias stood there a long time, the prairie stretching wide before him, feeling both the ache of what was lost and the quiet pride of what had been done. And he understood then that destiny was not a straight line, but a series of moments where fear and courage stood side by side, waiting to see which one you would claim. And as this tale closes, remember that stories like this live only as long as they are carried forward, whispered from one fire to the next. So if this journey through dust, regret, and redemption stirred something in you, ride with us again by subscribing to the Western Tales, because out here in the wide country of memory and myth, there are always more stories waiting to be told.